And the beauty of it is you don't need to understand who the northern king and the southern king exactly and what happened. The thing you need to understand is these things happened in real life, though Daniel had no idea about a northern and a southern kingdom. He had no concept. Remember, when he wrote this, the Persian Empire was just starting. And these are all things that are going to happen at the end of the Greek Empire and the beginning of the Roman Empire. He had no idea who Greeks and Romans were. And so he's writing these things hundreds of years in advance. And now we get to have them and look at them. And remember, God is explaining to Daniel the history of the Jews and the Gentiles. Daniel's been asking, what about my people? What about our land? What's going to happen to us? And God says, well, let me lay it out for you. And he's telling them basically, until the Lord, the Messiah, comes again, the Jews will be under the control of some Gentile nation. That's just the way it's going to be. And look at history. They might have their own little nation now, but if they were still living in a Gentile world-ruled world. And when the Antichrist comes, he will take whatever semblance of kingdom nation that they have, and he will just absorb that, just like the Greeks and the Babylonians and the Persians and the Romans did. So God has given him the history. Spoiler alert, when we get to the end, Daniel still wants to ask some questions, and God says, you know, that's enough, because all of this stuff doesn't pertain to your generation. So you just need to write it all down and lock it away so that the future generations will read it and understand it better. You're not going to be able to understand what the Persians and the Antichrist, he couldn't understand that. And God said, but I'm telling you everything. Just write it all down. And he didn't understand most of what he wrote down. That's why I kept asking questions. And didn't make, how much of it, if I just read through it, didn't give you the history of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom and this guy did this and that, how much of it would have made sense? None. So to Daniel, none of this makes sense because he doesn't have a historical perspective to put beside it and go, oh yeah, that's where that happened. Oh yeah, that happened right there. And so when we're reading it, we have the benefit of hindsight that we can see that. Now we're about to get the remote and change channels and then look into the future. But up until this point, it was all the future for Daniel, but we see it as events that have already happened. And how God has been working and how all of history affects the Gentile nations and the Jewish nations. Okay? And so God is revealing to him the history of the Jews and the Gentiles. As we kind of ended up last week, we had a couple of minutes and we got just slightly beyond the notes that you had, just because I was trying to get to a stopping point. So even though I think your notes before went to page 31 of the notes, I kind of went on and started talking about what happened after that, how the northern kingdom ruler Antiochus IV, he was in control of most everything. He had already conquered and kidnapped the ruler of Egypt, who was Ptolemy VI. And so he made a deal with Ptolemy VI that the two of them would go and take over and conquer the rest of Egypt, ruled by his brother Ptolemy VII. But neither one of them planned on keeping the deal. They were both going to stab each other in the back because this is just the way Antiochus did business. Several times he came into Jerusalem under the pretext of peace and turned around and slaughtered the civilians. But while he was trying to make this deal with Ptolemy VI, somehow another Ptolemy 6 and 7 got corresponding back and forth, and they made their own deal. And so when Antiochus goes strolling into Egypt, expecting that he's got the backing of Ptolemy VI and his armies, he comes to find out that all of Egypt is united against him, and he says, well, that's not, I can still beat them, I beat them before, but they had also called for reinforcements. They had called and made a treaty with this empire that was on the rise, a place called Rome. And the Roman fleet showed up. If you remember, the Romans were the ones who beat his daddy, Antiochus the Great, when he tried to go north and conquer the areas that Rome had their eye on, and soundly defeated, took money from him, took everything from him, his armies and everything, sent him back home in disgrace. So he had done that to Antiochus IV's daddy. Now the Romans show up with their fleet. And so you have all the Egyptian armies there, and here comes the fleet, and they start unloading with all the Roman armies. And they approach Antiochus, I told you last week, and the soldier, the commander of the Roman army, came up and drew a circle in the sand with his sword around Antiochus IV. And said, here's the deal. You know, you can either fight Rome, or you can leave, but you need to make your decision before you step out of the circle. He knew he couldn't beat Rome and Egypt. Humiliated, he turned and left Egypt. And he was not a happy camper. He was looking for somebody to take his wrath out on. I'm going to pillage and kill somebody, if it kills me, to find them. I know. We've got to go right back up past Jerusalem. I'll swing by there again. Now later you've got to figure, as the Jews would read this, or going through these things, remember hundreds of years later, God has certainly forsaken us. Surely God doesn't know what's happening to us. Well, yeah, He does. All you got to read Daniel and you can see, here's Antiochus came and he did this. Does that mean the end of us? Does this mean we're doomed and we're gone? No, because we seem to make it through that and we go on down to the next verses. So actually, even though they're going to go through these severe hardships, knowing that God is still going to preserve and always preserve a faithful remnant. And this is a time of testing for Jerusalem, and we'll talk about that as we go through. So he shows up, Antiochus IV, he shows up under the guise and the banner of peace. Now he had been through once before and looted and pillaged and everything and killed everybody who was not on his side. Thousands and thousands of Jews. And he put other Jews in place who were supposed to rule and reign in his place, collect money, taxes, that sort of thing. By the time he gets back, he finds out that there's a large group of faithful Jews, faithful to Jehovah, who would not go along with the ones he left in charge. He put evil men in charge of the temple and in the religion. So the high priest and all the priests and the ones who were supposed to be in taking care of the religion of the Jews, they were all handpicked and put in by Antiochus. There were a lot of Jews who did not think that that was right, to have evil men running the temple. And so when he comes in, he rewards all the Jews who sided with him, and he kills everybody he can get his hands on who sides against him. Yet again, just as he had done before. He also goes as far as outlawing all Jewish practices. You could not observe the Passover. You could not circumcise your son. You could not own Jewish scriptures. You could not make offerings on, remember they made offerings every morning and every evening at the temple. They made offerings on all the feast days. You couldn't have feast days anymore. Nothing having to do with the Jewish religion was now allowed in Palestine. And if they caught you with the scripture, or caught you because secretly you circumcised your son, or secretly you made an offering, they would just take you out and kill you. One of the historians, and I forget who it was, a Roman historian, recalls an incident where a woman had circumcised one of her children, and they found it. And they took the baby and killed it, tied it around the mother's neck, and made her parade as they beat her up and down the streets of Jerusalem until she died, with her dead child around her neck. This is Antiochus IV. This is why he has been called, history recalls him as Antiochus the madman. He called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, which had a deity attached to it. I am Antiochus the god. But a play of words, they just changed a couple letters around. Instead of Epiphanes, it was Epimenides, which is Antiochus the madman. So he outlaws all Jewish traditions, all Jewish rituals, all Jewish rites, and then he comes into the temple, where the Holy of Holies is. And he threw all of that stuff out, and he erected a statue to Jupiter. And in the place where the offerings used to be made to Jehovah, he started offering pigs on that altar, which is an unclean animal for the Jews, just to spite them and to desecrate their temple. The ones who went along with him, he promised them, gave them lots of money, power, prestige. Remember, they were ratting out their brothers and sisters, and they were getting paid for it. But there was still a group that would not go along with it. In particular, history records a priest by the name of Mattathiah, and he had 5 sons. And they rebelled against, and they did like guerrilla warfare against Antiochus and his army. And they tried to catch him, and they tried to, but they and their bands just kept nibbling at their heels, so to speak, and catching them off guard, and killing 10 here, and killing this legion over here, and ambushing these. And the most well-known of all of them was the son named Judas Maccabees, and he was nicknamed the Hammer. That'll kind of give you an idea of his temperament. But this is known in history as the Maccabean Revolt. The Maccabean Revolt. And for many, many years, these groups of rebellion, I think about 3.5 years, until finally they won. And he said, well, how did they beat Antiochus, his whole army? Remember what happened to him. When he was in Egypt and the Romans chased him away, there's a good chance he lost part of his army then. And he certainly lost a whole lot of followers that he had on the payroll. They would hire mercenaries and stuff from other countries. So when he got back to Rome, he didn't have anywhere near the size army that he had before. And so it was a smaller force, but after 3 years they couldn't win, and finally, in December 14th of 164, the temple was rededicated. They cleaned out the statue, and they went in and they had to make sacrifices and sprinkle the blood to clean out the vileness and where the temple had been desecrated.
Is that what Hanukkah celebrates?
Yes. Yeah, that is today. That's the rededication of the temple, is the holiday Hanukkah that is still celebrated every December. If you look in Daniel, let me read 35, because that's kind of where we're at. Some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end, because it is still to come at the appointed time. So, some of those who have insight, some of those who knew that you're not supposed to treat the temple that way, that you're not supposed to desert Jehovah, that you're not supposed to do these things as God's chosen people, they survived through this. They persevered through this, and it was a purging, a testing. It cleaned out those who were willing to say, well, fine, I won't worship Jehovah, I'll worship your God then. Especially if it's got some money in it for me. And that always leads to the question, there always could be a testing that could come upon any of us at any time. We're called upon to either announce or renounce your faith. To declare outwardly, publicly, openly, as loud and as bold as you can, yes, I believe in the Lord Jesus, and I don't care what it cost me. Or whether some of these said no, some just didn't say anything. Remember, to say nothing is to renounce. You're either with him, he said, or you're against him. And so God uses opportunities to purge his people, to make sure. God already knows what your faith is, but God will place us through trials and tribulations so that we can learn how great our faith really is. We might say one thing, but how do we act? How do we behave? So a lot of times testing and purging. So these Jews, they had to make a decision. And they thought they were making the one that would prolong their life, and ultimately it ended up they were the ones who would lose their lives. And the ones who they thought would lose their lives because they went against Antiochus, they were the ones who went through the trial and came out on the other side victorious. And notice that it says, that it talks about, at the end of 35, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that is decreed, that which is decreed will be done. That's in 36. I'm sorry, I missed the line. Because it is still to come at the appointed time. God has appointed times for all things. Remember Ecclesiastes, there's a time for all things. God is still in control during this time of purging, this time of testing. And he is purging the Jews, because who comes out of this will be a remnant, and they will be, for the most part, the faithful remnant. Now, will they fall away again? Yes, just read our history books. But God continues to work with his people. They will never go away completely. The ultimate purging that has happened is much later than this, about 200 years later. The Jews will deny Christ, which will then cost them another period of purging. It's called the time of the Gentiles, and they're still going through that today. So God says until a certain time, till the appointed time. Now when we get to 36 through 45, something happens. Up until this point, we've been able to read through this line, oh, that happened, and then this line, and that happened, and this line, and that happened. Now all of a sudden, we read these lines, and we look into history books, and there's nothing that lines up to explain what's going on. People have tried to. They might be able to pick out one or two things, but they're scattered over hundreds of years, and they don't really mesh together. So it's best to understand this, that although God is still talking about the history of the Jews and the history of the Gentiles, and how the Gentiles will affect the Jewish history, this isn't something that happened right after Antiochus. But Antiochus Epiphanes is a type of the Antichrist. As we start in 36, we are now looking much further to another appointed time that God has. And now he's going to start talking about another personality. And we can see some similarities, and we'll look through those and talk about them as we go. But these verses that we read here, they just don't coincide with history. And it can't be Antiochus. He died a couple years. Once he lost Jerusalem, he went back home, tried to pillage an area, and they caught him and killed him. So this great, mighty ruler died a death that, wasn't special, wasn't glorious, wasn't glamorous. These verses are going to be talking about a ruler, though. So if it's not Antiochus, who is it? And there's nobody else that we can draw a picture to. Let's read through real quick. Let's look at 36. Remember, now it's talking about a different king, somebody else. Then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. Well, who's the king who's raised up over top of many nations, declares himself to be the God over all gods, the head of all religions, that all the world has to worship him? Has that happened? See what I mean? And he will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is done, is finished. What's the indignation? What is he talking about there? If you remember, there's a passage that Jesus mentions in Matthew 24:15. And he talks about the time when the temple that he's standing in, he's looking forward to the future. And he's talking about there'll come a point in time when the abomination of abomination happens. And when that happens, the Jews, you need to run. You need to get out. Don't go home and get your things. You need to get out. And he is talking about these in his passage that he is talking about the end times. That indignation is, and as we relate this and also look into the book of Revelation, when the Antichrist comes and takes over Jerusalem in the second half of the 7-year period, then he is going to set up an idol, a statue of himself in the temple, in the same way that Antiochus set up this statue of Jupiter. And that will be the abomination of abominations. That not only would you set up a temple to another god with a little g, but you would set up a temple to yourself and call yourself the God over Jehovah God, above and beyond. And Jesus tells the Jews, when that happens, this is going to happen right at the midpoint of the tribulation. When you see that happens, he's telling the Jews, you need to run and get out. 37 says he'll show no respect for the gods of his fathers. And people says, well, that must mean he's a Jew then, because usually the Jews talk about the God of our fathers, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Well, no, if the God of his fathers was Zeus and Mercury or whoever, it doesn't mean he's talking about the Jewish gods. So, but he'll have no regard for the gods of his fathers or the desire of women. Now, some people say, well, this means he must be a homosexual, because he has no regard for the desire of women. Well, that's just trying to read something in that you wanted to say. At this point in time when Daniel wrote this, do you know what the great desire of women was? Yes, to be the mother of the Messiah. To be the woman that gives birth to the Messiah who the Lord is going to send. That is the desire. He has no regard. So what's the desire of women? It's the Messiah. So he has no desire for any gods. He has no desire for God the Father, and he has no desire for, no regard for the desire of women. And the desire of women is to produce Jesus. So he has no regard for Jesus and no regard for the, Now, you got to remember, Daniel didn't understand Jesus as the second person of the Holy Trinity. Jesus hadn't been born. So that's why it doesn't say Jesus, but it does say the desire of women, who would be the result of a woman, Jewish woman, giving birth to the Messiah. He has no regard for either the Father, any of the gods, or the Messiah who would come from a woman. Nor will he show regard for any other gods, and he will magnify himself above them all. Above any gods, every god. Buddhists, Mohammedans, Confucius, it doesn't matter which religion, he's in charge of all of them. Matter of fact, in Revelation, he appoints a great high priest who is going to be set up a one religion for the world. And that religion is him, to worship him. He will take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god. What is the foreign god? So he's going to go against the strongest of fortresses. Nothing's going to stand in his way. When the Antichrist comes, he will have so much might, so much power. He will trick people. He will conceive different ways of lying and manipulating people. And it will all sound great to everyone because he's empowered by the devil. And everybody will just sign it. That sounds great. Because the world will think he is the great deliverer. That he is the Messiah. Not the Jewish Messiah, not the Christian Messiah, but he is the Messiah that the real God has sent. And by the way, it's him. And so no fortress will be able to stand against him. He will have so much might. And then it says, the only God he's going to have that he will pay any attention to is, instead he will honor, I'm sorry, I lost myself. Instead, he will honor a God of fortresses and a God whom the fathers did not know, and will honor him with gold and silver and stones and treasures. Who is that God? Power. War. The only thing he's going to worship is more power, more strength, more might over the world. He has nothing else he pays any attention to. He would take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god. That's the God of war. And he will give great honor to those who acknowledge him, and will cause them to rule over many and parcel out land for a price. He will do kind of what Antiochus did. He comes in and make you a deal. You side with me. You let me have control of your armies. Let me have your oil. Let me have this. And I'll tell you what, I'll give you can rule. You can have America. You can have the United States. You just be on my side. Oh, I can have all of your stuff too. I'll tell you what, I'll give you France. As long as you stay with me and you work underneath me. And this is how he's going to control the world. And every time he does that, he gets more resources that the world needs. Raw materials, military might, all that. And the more he has, the more everybody else is on the outside. Well, we want to make a deal. How can we get in on this? Well, I'll tell you what, you give me all of your stuff, and I'm getting kind of low. You get Lithuania. Okay, but everybody's going to make these deals. And he's making all that. Now, he's not keeping any of these. He's making these deals to get everything that he wants, to rule the world. There was that one section, if you remember earlier on when they talk about the rulers and stuff, how he came up as a little horn and there was 10 horns. These are the 10 countries. And then the little horn came up and the first thing he did was wipe out 3 of the other little horns. Remember that? That's just what he's going to do. I'll make you a deal. I'll give you Spain. Great, we'll give you all of our stuff. Okay, he gets all of his stuff. Says, oh, I was just kidding. I'll kill you and put somebody else in charge. Now I got Spain and I don't owe you nothing. This is how it's going to work. At the end time, the king of the south, now we got some more battles coming. Now we're talking about the king of the south. He is not talking about the Ptolemies. Bless you. Now we're at the end times. We're at the time, those 7-year period of tribulation. We're in the middle of that. At that point in time, at some point in time during that, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots and horsemen and many ships, and he will enter countries, overflow them, and pass through.
That's you.
That's 3. She's good.
3.
Couple things. People say, well, wait a minute. If this is talking about the end times, and these are armies in the end times, they're not going to be in chariots and horses. This just goes to show you that the Bible doesn't know what it's talking about. All right? Imagine yourself in Daniel's time. Okay? You know stuff that Daniel knows. I want you to explain a B-52 bomber. What do you have that you've seen that you could relate that to the shape, to the speed, to anything? Or what the bombs do. What's a bomb? Well, it's a thing that falls out of the sky. Well, what is it? So, again, when he sees these visions, remember these are visions and stuff, they're given to him in something that he can understand. And even if he can't exactly understand it, he has to describe it in terminology that he knows. You can, if you saw something that nobody had ever seen before, how would you describe it to someone? Because there's no words to describe that. You would have to use pictures of things that everybody knows and says, you know, it was kind of like this and it was something like that, but this happened, but it's not like that, but it was something that I can't tell you. So yes, he's talking about horses and chariots and all these things. These are 2 armies. At some point in time, during the 7 years, a force from the south is not going to like, and it may be some of the African nations, and it could be Egypt and some of those. They don't like him. He's now coming down and taking over their things. And so they unite and get together, and they march north to fight against the Antichrist army. At the same time, whether it's collaborated or not, it most likely is, a force from the north comes down. Russia. And so they come down. And these two forces move down to fight against the Antichrist. And they lose. They lose. With horsemen and many ships, and he will enter countries and overflow them and pass through. They're going to both come like this, on him like this. He'll send out his armies and just wade right through them. And they lose. And he gains more property and more power and more military might and more influence. He will also enter the beautiful land. Now when he starts off, he will not have his headquarters in Jerusalem. It will be somewhere else. It is thought that it will actually be in Babylonia, in Babylon. Which fits with a lot of different scriptures. But he will, once he fights off the army to the north and the army to the south, and he goes, well, you know, I might as well, to make sure nothing happens, I'm kind of in the middle anyway, I'm just going to set up shop right here. And he enters into the beautiful land, enters Palestine, into Jerusalem. And many countries will fall, but these will be rescued out of his hands. Now God is working. He's going to try to take over everything, but there's going to be some things he's not allowed to do. Remember Job? Satan wanted to do some stuff to Job. Man, Lord, if you just let me do this, and then he'll curse you. And the Lord said, well, I'll tell you, you can do this, this, and this, but you can't do that. And I'll let you do this and this and this, but you can't do that. I'll only allow you to do certain things. He's going to fight. He's going to be conquering nations and stuff. And there's going to be little Edom down to the south with those caves and stuff. And somehow or another, they're just not going to be able to conquer that completely. Why? With all of their might? Because God's not going to give them into his hands. Remember when the Jews went into Canaan and God gave them the Holy Land? Land of milk and honey? He says, listen, I'm going to go before you and I'm going to fight the battles and I'll give, the Jebusites and the Ammonites and the Meunites and the whoever, all the ites, I'm going to just give them under your hands. So yes, you're going to battle again. I'm just going to give them, you win. You've already won. I've already done it. Well, God says, I'm not going to allow them to take these certain places. Edom and Moab, which were two areas just south of Jerusalem. So as much as the Antichrist wants to conquer and protect all of his borders, he's just not going to be able. And most likely, he's going to say there's not a lot of stuff there anyway. And I think one of the reasons why God protects that area is there's coming a point in time when the Jews are going to have to leave Jerusalem, and it may be that's one of the places where they'll go. It's thought that Petra is one of the places where they'll go and be protected in the caves. God is not going to allow him to have every place because God is going to protect that faithful remnant, even in the end. Then he will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. So that southern force that came up and lost, he said, well, fine, I'll just march on down now and I'll take Egypt. I've already taken care of your army, so now I'll go take care of everything else. 45 says, but he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver and over all the precious things of Egypt. You got to imagine all the precious things, all the antiques and the stuff that they've gotten into museums and stuff out of the tombs and all the riches that are in Egypt and all the wealth that is there because of the oil and all the money and things that they have, valuable things. But he's going to conquer and take care of all of that stuff. And silver and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and Ethiopians will follow at his heels. It's thought that Libyans and Ethiopians, which are the northern Africa, when they see him coming down and conquering Egypt, they'll side with the Antichrist and just follow in after him. He's going in to loot, they'll join with him and go in and get some stuff of their own now that they have the opportunity. But while all this is going on, at some point in time, he will hear rumors. Intel is going to start coming in from the east and from the north, which will disturb him. Now this has to be a little ways down the road. Remember, he already beat the north and repelled them back up. They have remassed. They have gotten new reinforcements. It might be you got some of Eastern Europe to come in. Maybe he's gotten some of the Chinese or whatever to join. But they have regrouped in the north, and there is a group from the east. So if you think about it, from the north is Russia, the east is China and India and Pakistan, and then up north you probably have Eastern Europe, and they've all, well, we didn't have enough the last time, so now we've got a bigger army. And they will go forth, he hears it and he's going to be very disturbed. And he will go forth with the great wrath to destroy and annihilate many. If you read in the book of Revelation, it talks about an army that will come up out of the east. He'll go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas. That would be like the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. Okay? And the beautiful holy mountain. Yet he will come to his end and no one will help him. When these armies come, everybody has grouped together now. And they're all coming to fight against the Antichrist. All these armies have joined together in the north and they're coming. And all of these armies have joined and they're coming in from the east and they're coming. And they're coming and they're going to battle him. And he's got his armies and they got their armies and they got armies. 200 million, another 100 million there, 400 million, 500 million. And they're all going to fight each other. But they don't fire a single shot at each other. You know why?
Jesus comes.
Jesus comes. It's Armageddon. They will all come and be pointing to fight themselves at each other, but when the Lord comes and stands on the mountain and it splits, and he stands there and they see him, instead of pointing all of their tanks and bazookas and missiles at each other, they're going to all turn and point them at the Lord. And they will be defeated without a single shot fired. Because the Lord will destroy them with the sword of his mouth. In the way that he created all things by saying, let there be, he can look at all of the might and the military prowess and the numbers and the expertise and the bravado of all that mankind has to offer, and he can just say, and let you not be. Battle over. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. The Antichrist is the fulfillment of the picture of Antiochus. The way he treated the Jews, the way he thought he could take over the world, the way that he thought he could fight everybody, but ultimately the powers of the world encircled him to the point that he couldn't even beat them. And the way that the Antichrist will try to garnish such a big army that no one can defeat him, not counting on the Lord's return. Jesus said at these point in times things are going to be so bad, so horrific, so terrible, that if God did not step in and cut it short, no person would be left on this earth. Can you imagine all the nuclear weapons and all the arms of all of the world all gathering together in one place? Can you imagine what happened if somebody pushed the first button? Jesus said, unless the Lord steps in to draw it to an end, no man would be left on earth. We don't have a lot of time to go into the Antichrist and all of his dealings. We did a lot of that during our study of the book of Revelation. So we're not going to repeat all of that. I just, some of the things that as we read through, the king of the north and the king of the south, that first attack that they had from the north, that most likely is the attack that's referred to in Ezekiel in chapters 38 and 39. But remember, there's a second attack that's going to come from the north, and that will be at the end times. That will be when we have the battle of Armageddon. And again, You saw how every time one general lost, they would just go back home and rebuild another army and come back. Well, same thing happened. The Northern, they lose and they're repelled and they go back. Seems he turns his emphasis south, deals mainly with Egypt to take all of their stuff. The Northern armies with their tails between their legs are defeated. They go back, but yet they create new alliances, rebuild another army and come back 3.5 years later. So we can kind of see how all of this will happen, but none of this has happened yet. That's why this can't be any Greek king, or even any Roman king if we count just the Roman Empire of antiquity. But it is the continuation of the Roman Empire, as we loved, but we had the statues earlier on, and the wild beast, and talking about that.
Yeah.
All right, any questions or observations? We're going to finish Daniel next week. Chapter 12, that's a shorty. No questions? Father God, we just thank you for your word. Lord, we look around this world and we see all the trouble. We see all the armies and all the wars, all the problems. And Lord, it is comforting for us to know, not that we live in such a world, but that you're in control and that you know all things. And so, Lord, it's important that we remember that we trust you. In spite of all that is going on and in the midst of all that's going on. Because only you will prevail. So, Lord, help us in our times of worry and concern. Lord, help us to rest on your word and on your Son and the gift of salvation that he gives. Amen.